I don't remember much from my childhood. I lived in a small town south of Krakow with my mom, dad, and two sisters. Those early days are a blur, but I remember going door to door around the neighborhood, asking for treats during the Dojinki Harvest Festival. It was a tradition of ours, since we knew the neighbors always bought too much candy. We'd gather leftovers and make a feast of our own. At every door, you were greeted with a cheeky smile as the neighbors lovingly cussed out the scoundrel children of the Dabrowski home. Of course, happy memories are happy for a reason, because things get worse, and you get something to compare them to. My parents separated. My mother moved us to Warsaw, where we could be closer to my grandparents and uncles. Meanwhile, my father, Jaromir, did his best to stay in our lives, but it got harder and harder. He needed to work longer and longer hours, but he still sent us money every month. He wanted us to have a beautiful life, even if he couldn't be there for it. With every passing year, those visits grew further and further away. First, we lost Easter, then Christmas, then the birthdays, and finally, our yearly Dojinki Festival meetup. Last we heard of him, he was barely making ends meet. He wasn't sending money anymore, and over time, he disappeared into memory. My mother remarried, my sisters graduated. My oldest sister moved to Ljubljana, while my younger went to Munich. My mother stayed in Warsaw with her new husband, but once the kids were out of the picture, she moved into her summer home up north. I love my mother dearly, but she's always had an eye for the luxurious. Always planning the next trip, the next sun-baked afternoon. I stayed in Warsaw. I got myself a degree in sociology and managed to hold on to a low-rank government job at ZUS, overseeing private claims. It wasn't glamorous, it was mostly being yelled at in different ways, but it paid the bills. A mind-numbing battle of making decisions, defending them, and making them again. The year I turned 24, I got a letter from an estate lawyer. Turns out my father had passed away. This wasn't recent. According to the papers, he'd passed away several years ago. Some kind of accident with farm equipment. He didn't have a proper will, and dividing the estate among his living descendants hadn't been a state priority. It got lost in a folder somewhere, and now it had floated back up. They'd divided everything equally between me and my sisters. My youngest sister got his savings. My oldest got his car and valuables. And I got the house. I called the others to check who wanted to go see his grave. No one wanted to. They were all tangled up in their own lives and troubles. My family were under the impression that my father had abandoned us, and this was a way for us to abandon him back. I had a different impression. I always thought he was just working too hard. I decided I'd take some time off work to collect his things and check out the property, trying to get a better idea of why he distanced himself from us. And maybe I could get a better picture of my early life, that time where I was greeted with a smile rather than a complaint. It was a long drive. The roads out there aren't the best. It's a very small community with no more than about 250 people, most of which are wheat farmers, and there's not that much to do. There are only two things other than farms, a church and a store. Everything else is either too far away or too irrelevant. Going past the endless fields, I got so lulled into a rhythm that I almost missed the exit. It's so small that you can accidentally pass it by if you don't take the right turn. There are no signs. You can only recognize it from the church in the distance. I took a left turn and prayed to God the suspension would hold a little longer. I decided to pay the old church a visit. We'd spent a lot of time there. There was plenty of parking. It was smaller than I remembered, but then again, everything looked bigger back then. There is something uneasy about coming home after so long. As I stepped out of the car, it all just came back to me. The smells, the sounds. Even if you can't put your finger on it, there's something that tickles the mind, as if to remind you, this is where you belong. "Welcome," a voice called out. "Sorry about the state of things." I turned around to see a man, a couple of years older than myself. He had well-combed hair and thick glasses. He was wearing a priest's garb. I'd almost forgot. The village priest had been old even back when I was young. No wonder there was a new one. "I'm Father Cherniak," he continued. "Are you new in town or passing through?" "I grew up here," I said. "I'm one of the Dabrowski kids." "Sorry, I'm not familiar," he smiled. "I only came here last winter to pick up the work from Father Golick." "He lived until last winter?" I asked. "Are you sure?" "Quite so," he laughed. 101 years old? "I can't believe it," I smiled. "God really does have a sense of humor." Father Cherniak showed me around. He told me his plans for refurbishing the windows. But the one thing that irked him more than anything was the doors. See, they were gone. The church was wide open. "It's a local superstition," he sighed. "A shepherd needs his gate to tend his flock. But every time I put the doors up, someone takes them down." "Strange," I said. "I've never heard that before." "Really? I thought you were from the area." "Guess I've been gone too long, Father." The church looked naked in a way. No barriers. I could see the gravel they'd dragged in, forgetting to wipe their feet. Father Cherniak had tried to put up some curtains, but the wind had torn them down piece by piece. Before I left, he showed me my father's grave. It had been vandalized. The headstone had tipped over, and there were no flowers. I promised myself to make it a little nicer before I left, but I didn't understand. Sure, my family wasn't perfect, but we'd never been hated. This grave looked outright despised. I thanked Father Cherniak and made my way across town. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. All through town, there were these wide-open houses just like the church. At first, I thought it was some kind of summer cleaning going on, but no, all doors were gone. They weren't just open, they were removed. I could see all the way into people's living rooms. The hustle and bustle as homeowners moved from kitchen to bedroom, talking amongst themselves. I slowed down and looked a little closer. Not a single room had a door, not even the bathrooms. A couple of them had curtains or insect nets put up, but no doors. House after house, completely open to the elements. A couple of them had welcome mats by the windows in their living rooms, as if to show that this was the way to enter. A couple of them had completely bricked the entrances where their front doors used to be, sealing it. Sure, small towns can get a bit quirky, but I'd never seen anything like this. I pulled up to an all-too-familiar driveway and gasped. I couldn't recognize my home. It had been vandalized. Every window broken, every door removed. I could see rats scurrying around. Walking around the property, things got even worse. There had been a small fire in the backyard, spreading to the outer wall of the kitchen. It wasn't completely burned down, but you could probably punch straight through with little effort. And finally, on the far side, neon green spray paint reading Sin Diablo, Son of the Devil. I couldn't believe it. They'd even clipped the chains off our swing set, leaving a rusted metal skeleton. It looked like someone had tried to start a tire fire, but couldn't quite get it going. I had a hard time even picturing what it used to look like. There was this bottomless hole forming in my stomach, where every smile I remembered seemed like a cruel taunt. Something must have happened. Something I'd never even heard of. Coming back around, I noticed a crowd of middle-aged men. They were standing just outside the property, looking over my car. I didn't recognize any of them. "You at the bank?" one of them asked. "No, I'm the Dabrowski kid," I said. "The son." "You're the son?" he spat. "You want to join him in hell? Is that it?" "You know who did this?" I snapped back, pointing at the house. "Was it you?" "Could have been anyone," a man in the back added. "Fucker deserved it." One of them gave me a knowing smile and nodded at the graffiti. They whispered something among themselves, letting out a chuckle under their breaths. They scoffed at me and wandered off, spitting curses and sneers. Not quite the welcome I'd imagined. I'd initially planned on sleeping in the old house, but there was no way. Not only was it wide open, it was a disgusting mess. I'm not going to go into detail what they'd done to the place, but I'd be lucky if I was able to give it away in its current state. I decided to spend the night sleeping in my car. I leaned the seat back and wrapped myself in a blanket, hoping it wouldn't get too cold. I spent some time on my phone, but I didn't want to use all the battery. But somehow, I still ended up staying awake long past midnight. But there was something beautiful about that night. The sunset was one of the few things that didn't change around those parts. Watching the sun go down over the same old fields gave me that feeling that some things never change. I remember waking up sometime around 2 a.m., seemingly for no reason. It wasn't cold, there was no one bothering me, and no notifications on my phone. A careful wind brushed against the hood of the car. I lay there for a moment, trying to ignore the texture of the seats sinking into my sweaty skin. I filtered out the sounds of nature bleeding in from outside. A distant part of me had heard them all before. I listened past the songbirds and the insects in the fields, and beyond that, there was something else. Something in the distance. A wail. A deep, sorrowful wail. The following day, I took some time to walk around town. The rumor that Jaramir's kid was back had spread like wildfire. I could tell by the sideways looks as people passed me on the street. The only ones who didn't seem to care were the kids, and they were few and far between. At the far end of the town, there was this long brick wall. It wasn't very high, but it was dense. It had doors built directly into it, dozens of them, every door from every house in the neighborhood. They'd jammed them all straight into the brick. I couldn't see ours, though. It had an eerie look to it. Maybe 100 or more doors, all built to never be opened. I couldn't help but touch a few handles, making sure they didn't budge. There were a couple of teenage kids standing at the edge of the wall, observing me. I walked up to them, surprised to see they didn't back down. They had a cocky look to them, but at least they weren't openly hostile. Before I could say anything, they turned to me. "My mom hates you," one of them said. "What did you do?" "I used to live around here," I said. "Came to get some things." "Why'd you come back?" he scoffed. "I'm leaving the moment I can afford it." "Same," said the other, rolling an unlit cigarette between his fingers. I gave them a tired look. A man passed us further down the street, throwing daggers at me with his eyes. Talking to the wrong person would get my teeth knocked out for sure. I turned to the kids, lowering my voice. "I'm Dabrowski's son," I admitted. "That's why they hate me." The second kid nearly dropped his cigarette. I managed to bribe them into a conversation with the promise of a six-pack from the next town over. In return, they'd give me the unofficial tour of what had happened these past few years. A fair trade, I suppose. I'd apparently missed quite a lot. We wandered to the east side of town. There was an old farm that had stood there for ages. It didn't really have a name. It had just been part of the background. It was barely even a frame anymore. It was just the outline of what had once been a home. It had started years ago. People heard knocking coming from that ruin. It used to have this door that still stood, clinging to the edge of a rotted-out doorframe. You could hear it at night, one of the kids explained. Knock, knock, like a door to hell. Sounds awful, I said. Not to everyone, the other kid sighed. There was one guy who liked it. It wasn't a hard guess as to whom that might have been. Rumor was my dad had gone up there one night and opened the door. It had crumbled off the hinges, and according to the townsfolk, something stepped through. Some called it the devil. A couple of kids thought it was an alien. Most locals just called it Schlepiek. It came through and the door broke, the first kid said, and now it can't go back. So you're saying it's still here? I asked. It's real? Well, yeah, he laughed. Why do you think this place is so fucked up? Then what's with the doors? It's looking for a way back to hell, he said. And when it can't find the right door, it gets angry. And then it hurts people. Schlepiek. That's what they called it. An ugly word for a blind man or mole. They like to call it that because of its terrible vision, mistaking every door for the one it was looking for. For years, Schlepiek had moved from house to house, knocking on every door it could find. And if someone opened, it would do something terrible. People had gone missing. A couple had died. I drove my adolescent guides to the other town over to get them their promised beer. They told me all they could as we went. It felt a bit weird driving off with a couple of teenagers, but I got the impression that these two had done far worse for far less. Delinquents, but honest ones. At first, people had hidden in their homes. But then, Schlepiek had knocked until the doors broke. Then it would knock on the inner doors. So, over time, people removed their doors. Those who didn't would get a visit at some point. With all the discarded doors, they built the brick wall, tricking Schlepiek into knocking around at night. This can't be true, I said. It's absurd. It's true, the first kid said. That's why they hate your dumb dad. He let it in. But it doesn't make sense. Why don't you just pack up and leave? I'm gonna, the first kid said. I told you. The second kid pondered the question for a while, then shrugged at his friend. He answered as if he'd thought about it 100 times. Wszędzie dobrze, ale w domu najlepiej. Everywhere is good, but home is best. Of course he'd say that. Come hell or high water, home is home. I got them their six-pack and some fast food. I got some for myself while I was at it. It wasn't a long drive all in all, but long enough to be a bother. By the time we got back, it was almost dark. They rushed out of the car, waving a hasty goodbye. As they did, the second kid called back to me. Go see for yourself, he said. Schlepiek comes out at night. He pointed down the street towards the brick wall. I nodded at them in a silent thanks. I didn't believe them. I had to see Schlepiek for myself. If what I'd heard the previous night was any indication, Schlepiek would be out somewhere after midnight, so I went to bed early. And when I say bed, I mean sleeping in my car for the second night in a row. I was miserable. I considered leaving first thing in the morning, but there was this deep sadness in me that I couldn't shake. This was my old home. I'd played in these fields. It felt wrong knowing I was no longer welcome. My dad was many things, but no devil's son. If he opened that door, it must have been for a good reason. And if he let through something that shouldn't be here, it must have been an honest mistake. He was not an evil man, but he was fallible. Then again, maybe he didn't have a choice. Maybe Schlepiek didn't give him a choice either. I must have nodded off at some point. I forgot to set an alarm, but I still woke up at about 2:30 a.m. I considered going back to sleep, but I decided to have one last look around town. I'd promised myself I would. So I got out of the car, stretched, and listened. It was easier that night. There was a noise that cut straight through the ambience. That wailing. It was clearer. Even in the dark, I could tell where it came from. The houses had turned off their lights, leaving the streets lit up with nothing but the moon. Still, I knew those streets. I could follow them in my sleep. I made my way to a dirt path, leading me past the two houses at the edge of town and straight to the brick wall. At that point, I could hear it clear as day. It was a man wailing at the top of his lungs, crying his soul out, bawling like a child. I could see the brick wall in the distance. The sharp contour of the bricked-in doors stood out against the moonlight like a long, flat, abstract painting. And in the middle of it all, there was a dark silhouette. It looked like a man, sort of. I couldn't really tell what he was like. He had a bulky jacket on. He was pulling on one of the doors, smacking it over and over with a closed fist. It was the same pattern, over and over. Pull, smack, smack. Pull, smack, smack. And in between every attempt, he jerked his head around, crying desperately. I considered walking up to him. This wasn't some kind of devil. This was a heartbroken man. As I took a few steps closer, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. A light. I turned around only to notice a small flashlight coming from one of the nearby houses. They were filming me with their phones. Looking closer, I could see two little heads peeking out, shaking their heads in a certain no. Turning back to the brick wall, I heard a sudden crack. The man had pulled one of the doors straight out of the wall. It came loose. He set it down next to him and with one hand pushed it downward. He didn't even have a good grip, but with a single hand, he broke the door into pieces. The wailing turned into a scream. Rage. Unfiltered, unhindered rage. With just his fingers, he began to rip bricks straight out of the wall, tossing them around like leaves in the wind. I could hear them landing around me, kicking up tufts of grass. I backed away as the lights in the house went out. The little heads dipped away from the window. I hurried down the dirt path as I watched Schlepiek climb on top of the brick wall, screaming at the top of his lungs. Even at a distance, I could tell something was off. His proportions seemed wrong. It was hard to tell. He'd wrapped himself in some kind of dark fabric, but something about him didn't look right. I didn't stop to stare. Say what you will. Maybe it was just a strange man. Either way, I was looking at something dangerous. And when the locals turned to hide, you do best to follow suit. So I hurried down the dirt path, hearing his terrifying scream echo across the fields. I barely slept that night. It is one thing to believe in monsters, and another thing to see them. As soon as the sun rose, I drove off. But as I went past the church, I noticed something. There is a white van outside, and one of the church doors had been put back up. There were two men on ladders getting ready to put the other door up. It was hidden under a tarp, just off to the side. I could see Father Cherniak up front with a big smile on his face. I decided to see what was going on. Surely he had to know what the hell he was doing. The moment I parked my car, Father Cherniak waved me over. He was right next to me before my boots hit the gravel. "Welcome back," he smiled. "Glad to see you haven't left us yet." I closed the car door and yawned a little. "What are you doing?" I asked. "What is this?" "You inspired me," he said. "For an outsider, this place must have looked awful. I saw it, you know. I saw it in your face." He turned back to the church as the two carpenters began tipping up the second door. "It must be dignified," he continued. "Our Lady deserves better, don't you think?" "This is a bad idea," I said. "I've seen that thing around town." Father Cherniak shook his head and put a hand on my shoulder. This was a man who was trained to talk to people, I could tell. If the Lord's house can't shelter you from the devil, what can? In exchange for a little manual labor, I was offered a hot shower and a proper meal. After sleeping in my car for a couple of days, I couldn't say no. Smooth talker or not, Father Cherniak seemed an honest man. He believed what he spoke of. As the hours passed, more and more people dropped by. Mostly townsfolk coming by to cuss him out for being an idiot. Some of them threw rocks at the doors, demanding he take them down. Others, in turn, thought it was about time someone at the church had some balls. Just like Father Cherniak had said, "If a house of the Lord can't shelter you from evil, what can?" By late afternoon, there was a significant gathering of people. Even those who had acted in anger earlier in the day were swayed. The argument was simple. Do they not trust in God? There was a bit of a cookout. Some brought sausages or steak for dinner. I spotted the two teenagers in the crowd, stealing a bit of wine from one of the elderly. I lost track of time. It felt a bit like the harvest festival back in the day, something that draw the town out of hiding. The sounds and smells were the same, and I could see from the smiles in the crowd that I wasn't the only one feeling that way. Later in the day, Father Cherniak held a sermon. I don't remember much of it. I was having trouble staying awake. That, if anything, felt just like when I was a kid. It's amazing how something as stiff as church pews can be so lulling. But there was one part that stuck with me. "The door is a threshold," he said. "And the door of a church is the threshold between the vile and the sacred, between sin and saint. We can no longer live in uncertainty. We must live as we teach, and we are proud to say we have been taught well." The sermon continued into the evening. It ended just after sunset. Some people wandered home, but others were ashamed to stay. It was no longer just a public gathering. It had turned into a challenge. The faith of the congregation pitted against the devil itself. Some went home to gather blankets and pillows, laying down to sleep on the floor. This wasn't easy for them. Some talked about the people who'd disappeared over the years, people who'd opened the door when Schlepiak first came to knock. An elderly woman had gotten her neck broken. One man had been dragged out into the yard and hung from a tree. Another man had been mutilated. "It pulled his arm right out of the socket," they whispered. "We found it across the street." I tried talking to people, but it was clear that no one wanted anything to do with me. I was still Jeremir's boy. The only ones who didn't seem to mind were the two teenagers I'd talked to earlier. Later that evening, they walked up to me, probably just to piss off their parents. "Aren't you scared?" one asked. "Should I be?" "It's got a bloody tooth for you," the other said. "I don't think so," I smiled. "I've only seen it once." "Yeah, but They quieted down, looking at one another, then back at me. I was missing something. "Your dad," they said. "Schlepiek got him." "Did no one tell you?" They hadn't. Turns out, it wasn't malfunctioning farming equipment that had killed him years ago. It was Schlepiek. My dad had been the first victim on the list. Most of the villagers had considered this a sinner, getting his just reward. Others figure that if you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. They'd found him tangled in the swing set, his body broken and mangled. The kids left me alone with my thoughts for a while. They could tell I wasn't all there. It was one thing to have him dead, but to die in such a horrifying way was unthinkable. I could barely picture him in my mind, and now there was a new image vying for my attention. Rattling chains, dripping blood. But there wasn't much time to think. As the clock passed midnight, someone came knocking. The church fell silent. Something pulled on the handles. 2 smacks. Pull on the handle again. These doors were massive, and the hinges had just been reinforced, but I could still see them struggle. Father Cherniak took a deep breath. As the congregation fell silent, he spoke aloud. "This is no place for sons of sin," he said. "There is nothing for you to corrupt." It all stopped. We all breathed a sigh of relief, but the 2 teenagers didn't look too convinced. They'd huddled up on the far side of the church. There was an emergency exit in one of the side rooms. The door moved again, this time with more determination. The handles were pulled even harder, and the smacking made the entire slab of wood crackle like a sinking ship. Then, the wailing. The loud, desperate wailing. As soon as I heard it, I could see the color drain from the congregation's faces. The door was pulled back and forth, back and forth. A chandelier started to shake. "The door's coming down!" someone called out. "It's coming down, now!" Father Cherniak tried to calm them, but it was too late. People flooded the rear exit of the church, trying to get away. I was pushed aside without much thought. If the Dabrowski kid bit the bullet, all the better, as far as these people were concerned. "There is no sin in the house of the Lord," Father Cherniak yelled. "There is no sin. The devil can laugh and jeer as much as he likes, but there is no place for his evil." But thoughtful words can't stop a broken door. Schlepiek wasn't deterred. The doors came down. There was a pause in the air as they fell. The air swept through the room, blowing out most of the candles among the pews. As the doors hit the ground, the crowd panicked. Most of them were already on their way out. People screamed, others cursed. I was in the far back of the crowd, and it was clear I was never going to make it out without being crushed. I settled instead for hiding among the front pews, hoping the dark would shield me. I could barely see Schlepiek in the flickering candlelight. His right arm had grown out of his shoulder blade, and his left arm was so long that it scraped against the floor. He had a sort of hunchback pose, but there was something that kept moving on his back, fluttering, like a shivering membrane. He wasn't wearing a coat. He just wasn't human. He looked like something vaguely trying to resemble a human. Even Father Cherniak ran, hiding behind the altar. Schlepiek rushed through the room in a messy gallop, knocking over pews as he went. They didn't even slow him down. When he got to the side room, people had already run screaming into the night. Schlepiek couldn't catch them. Instead, he settled on throwing things across the room, tearing down whatever he could reach, and breaking whatever he could lay his hands on. His wailing had turned to rage, and he was out of control. I was laying flat on my stomach, crawling away. Father Cherniak wasn't so lucky. Just like Schlepiak had done with the brick wall, he climbed up on the altar. From there, he could see the priest. I don't like to recall what I saw. It's unworthy to make spectacle of tragedy. But Schlepiak didn't care for titles or words. He didn't care about anything. He picked Father Cherniak up with a single arm, holding him outstretched in front of him like a child, considering an unfamiliar vegetable. Father Cherniak tried his best. In between desperate cries, he said the most powerful words he knew. He compelled, he demanded. And when nothing seemed to work, he begged and prayed. Then, Schlepiak unhinged his jaw like a snake. The screaming stopped with a snap as a spray of blood shot out. Something thumped against the altar and rolled onto the wooden floor. A pair of glasses clattered against the ground. Schlepiak spat and coughed, picking tufts of hair from his teeth. He let the body slip from his grip, drooping unceremoniously to the red carpet. I remember crawling. I crawled as quietly and carefully as I could. Schlepiak was big, but his footsteps were light, like he was tiptoeing everywhere he went. I didn't notice he was behind me until his shadow drowned me. I rolled around, only to see his vast shape towering over me. He must have seen me. There were still a couple of candles. For a moment I saw his face, a half-made gray thing with black, inward-leaning concave eyes, a faint shimmer, like scales from a fish, a human mouth with an extra mandible, a twitching nose, adjusting to the smell of burnt wax and blood. Viscera still dripped from his strange lips. Then he grabbed me, carefully, slowly. I closed my eyes as I was pulled in closer. He looked at me. He looked close. I could feel the heat of his mouth. Perhaps I'd be tastier. Then he made a noise. I can't put my finger on what kind of noise it was, but I'd never heard it before. A squeal, perhaps. A confused rattle. He put me back down. I opened my eyes as those large black eyes turned away from me. He was leaving. His rage subsided. As he dragged his long arm across the floor, his wailing bubbled back up. But it wasn't as desperate. It was confused. The effects of the attack was immediate. Some went to get their hunting gear. Others were blaming the priest, saying he wasn't holy enough. Others were leaving town entirely. After all, if God couldn't save them, they had to save themselves. I made my way back to my father's home. There was so much he'd never told me, and it was too late to ask. I had no idea what kind of mess he'd been wrapped up in, but I couldn't stand by and wait for it to blow over. If this was his fault, if all of this was his fault, I'd gladly join the others to spit at his name. But I couldn't do it without knowing for sure. I had to be sure. I went room by room, pulling out drawers and kicking over boxes. I threw around moth-eaten clothes. I tipped the bed. I dragged down the wardrobe, crashing it into the wooden floor, hoping I could find something, anything, to answer my questions. Finally, I ran out into the backyard. I saw the stains on the swing set. I remember him pushing me on it, making the chains creak as I went higher and higher. But now that noise meant something else, something dark. An image of a broken man, wrapped in a forgotten toy. I don't know how long I went berserk on that house, but I remember finally just taking a swing at it. As I mentioned, a part of the kitchen had burned. You could punch right through it. So I did. Turns out there was a secret panel beneath the kitchen sink. I didn't register it at first. I just thought I'd hit a second, harder wall. But as I calmed down and looked a little closer, I realized it was a small compartment under the sink. I'd punched right through from the outside. I sat down flat on the wet grass, feeling it soaking into my jeans as I dug around. There was a box. Most of it was tainted by rats. Part of it was burnt, but there were little bits and bobs that I could make sense of. Family albums, mostly pictures of me and my sisters, friends from around the village, a picture of Dad next to his first car, pictures from our Facebook, printed and framed, the kind of things one would like to keep. Then the pictures stopped. No more dates, no more birthdays, nothing. But I kept turning the pages, and in the back there was something else. Other pictures, notes, pictures of a door with a text written on the back. It's not screaming, it's crying. Little notes on the margin, saying it was afraid. It was lost, that no one listened and that no one cared. There were no more pictures, but there were notes. He had to get out, wants to stay. He hunts elk in the forest, brings it to me. There's nothing left for him. I understand. It told a story of my father trying to help something that didn't belong, something from another place. They shared meals and kindness, trying their best to find common ground. This had seemingly gone on for months. It spoke of spring and later, winter. I will let him sleep in the house, the final note said. Maybe it can help his night terrors. Something must have happened. A dangerous creature like that, inside a small house. Maybe there was an accident, a misunderstanding. Maybe it strung him up by the chains to make him look alive, like a puppet. Either way, I was close to an answer. Maybe I was looking more like my father than I'd realized. Looking back at it, I felt like a sleepwalker. I wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe it was the adrenaline. I walked around in a daze, making my way back into town. It was quieter now. Many had rushed to their cars. I followed the dirt road back to the brick wall, and I found him. Schlepiek, wailing weakly, tapping against the bricked-in doors, pulling a little on a handle, hoping against hope that something would happen. He wasn't angry when I approached. He was confused. I had to make him understand, to see the truth of things. So, despite everything I'd seen and everything I heard, I decided to trust my instinct. My father had made many mistakes, but he was no fool. His mistakes were honest. So, if this was a mistake, I prayed to God it would be an honest one. Follow me, I said. This way. Schlepiek had feather-light steps. I could still hear commotion around town, but it was all swallowed by that soft wailing. Schlepiek couldn't stop himself. We made our way to the cemetery, to the overturned headstone and the overgrown lot. I tapped the ground, looked at this creature, and said it as simple as I could. Here, I said, Father. Perhaps it understood me. Perhaps it didn't. But it could rip out handfuls of dirt, like if it was nothing, and it did. It took a long time, but not as long as it should have. My dad had not been buried deep or well. Just as no one had cared for his funeral, no one had cared about his resting place. It didn't take long for Schlepiek to make his way down. And as his hands hit the casket, I looked down to a curious sight. See, my father had died poor. So poor that they hadn't put much effort into his casket. It was more like a box, and the lid looked familiar. Looking a little closer, I realized it was a door. The actual front door of our house. They'd just thrown it on and called it a day. Schlepiak stroked the door with his long fingers, his wail slowing to a hum. He'd finally found the right door, the one he'd been looking for. I'll never forget that image for as long as I live. An ungodly creature breaking open the casket lid, pushing away a bed of dry blue sunflowers, lifting a long-forgotten corpse from its resting place, cradling it like a mother calming a crying child, its wailing turning to a quiet sob. "Ta-ta!" he cried. "Ta-ta!" Schlepiaks wandered off into the night, past the men with guns, and those hunkering down in their houses. He did not care. Maybe he'd never cared. Maybe he'd just been angry that he couldn't find the right door. But as the chaos settled, there'd be no need to hide your doors any longer. Schlepiak was gone. I sold my father's property but kept the photo albums. His name is still spoken like a curse, but at least there's nothing to keep that curse alive. There have been no more sightings of Schlepiak, as far as I know. The locals didn't want to point fingers at the devil when they called the authorities. Some tried, but it's easier to convince people of a killer rather than a monster. There were inquiries around the countryside, but as with most things, it was left in an open-ended folder in an office somewhere. Unsolved. Deprioritized. I returned to Warsaw. It might not be my home, but home is not just a place. It's a time. And that time has long passed. It has taken some effort to accept that for now, I might not have a real home. But that doesn't mean I'll never have one. Much like Schlepiak, I think there's a struggle in finding someplace you belong. But over the southern countryside, the forest lies still. There is no wailing, no knocking, no screaming. And I think that somewhere beyond the trees, anyone can find a place to call home.
I needed a night shift job bad. I stood there, shivering in the dead-eye chill of a Tuesday midnight, staring at that ATM screen like it was a holy relic. The machine was old, one of those clunky, off-brand ones in the back of a 24-hour bodega, and it was humming. A low, electrical thrum that I could feel in the soles of my sneakers. The green neon text was flickering, just a tiny bit, sending a rhythmic, nauseating pulse into the dark. Balance, $7.42. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just watched that blinking cursor, feeling the lump in my throat grow until it felt like a stone. Rent was due in 72 hours. My landlord, a guy who smelled like stale cigarettes and took a perverse pleasure in reminding people of their legal obligations. He wasn't the type for extensions. I could practically hear my dad's voice on the other end of a phone call I hadn't made yet. That heavy, saturated sigh. The long silence before he'd say, "Again, Leo, truly." That tone. The one that makes you feel 6 inches tall. I couldn't call him. I'd rather starve. I turned away from the machine, the bodega's bell chiming with a tinny mocking sound as I stepped back out onto the street. The campus was a ghost town. The street lamps were casting these long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and pull at the edges of my vision. I found myself walking toward the community board near the library, a massive, cork-covered wall layered with months of rotting paper and forgotten dreams. I was looking for anything: plasma donation, clinical trials, night shifts at the warehouse. But then I saw it. It wasn't buried under the others. It was pinned right at eye level, a fresh, crisp sheet of white paper with jagged hand-drawn black text that seemed to vibrate under the sodium light. Sitter wanted. One night only. Remote Notification. $500 cash. Inquire within. $500 for one night. It was an impossible number, a too good to be true number. My gut, that little voice that usually keeps me out of trouble, it gave a sharp, cold tug in my chest. But when you're down to $7, you don't listen to your gut. You silence it. You tell it to shut up so you can eat. I pulled my phone out. My fingers were so cold they felt like wooden dowels, and I dialed the number. I expected a machine. I expected a scam. Instead, it picked up on the first half ring. The man who answered, Mr. Ullman, he didn't sound like a local. He sounded like a ghost from a 1940s radio broadcast. His voice was deep, impossibly cultured, and smooth, too smooth, like he was reading a script he'd memorized a century ago. He didn't ask for references. He didn't ask about my major or my background. He just asked one thing, his voice dropping into a low, resonant hum. Do you have a reliable vehicle, Leo? And are you a young man who appreciates the sanctity of absolute silence? I told him I'd be there by 10. I didn't even ask what I was sitting for. I was too busy calculating how many boxes of ramen $800 could buy. The drive took nearly an hour, though it felt like I was traveling through different centuries rather than just miles. I watched the gas stations and the glowing neon of fast food joints fade away, replaced by the deep suffocating wall of the pines. My rusted Honda felt smaller out here. The engine's rattle, which usually felt like a familiar comfort, now sounded thin, vulnerable against the immense, pressurized silence of the back roads. The GPS had given up somewhere near the county line, leaving me to follow a set of handwritten directions that seemed to lead me deeper into a place where the trees leaned over the asphalt like skeletal fingers, their branches scraping against the roof of my car with a sound like long fingernails on a chalkboard. Then the house appeared. It didn't just sit on the land, it loomed over it. It was a Victorian monstrosity, a jagged architectural scar against the moonlight. It was all sharp peaks, blackened wood, and narrow, staring windows that looked like rows of dead eyes. There was a turret on the left side that pierced the night sky, and a wraparound porch that seemed to be receding into the shadows. I parked my car in the gravel driveway, the sound of the stones crunching beneath my tires, feeling violent, intrusive, in a place that seemed to be holding its breath. I sat there for a second, my hand on the keys, watching the house. There were no lights on in the windows, just a solid, impenetrable blackness. I stepped out, and the air hit me. It wasn't just cold, it was sterile. It didn't smell like the woods. It smelled like nothing. The front door creaked open before my foot even touched the top step. Mr. Ullman was waiting. He was tall, impossibly tall, and he stood in the frame with a posture that was so perfectly straight it felt unnatural. He was wearing a dark three-piece suit that looked expensive, but the cut was from another era entirely. Beside him stood his wife. She wore a high-collared black dress, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But it was her face that made the hair on my arms stand up. Her hair was pulled back so tightly into a bun that it seemed to stretch the skin of her forehead, pulling her eyes into a wide, unblinking stare. She was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a perfect expression, the kind of look someone might practice in a mirror for hours, a masterpiece of the uncanny valley, "Leo," Mr. Ullman said. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to resonate in the floorboards beneath my feet. "You are punctual, a rare trait in the modern world. Please, come into the warmth." The foyer was a museum of the bizarre. The walls were covered in heavy, dark velvet drapes that swallowed the light from the dim chandelier, and everywhere I looked there were eyes. Taxidermy heads, deer, foxes, things I couldn't quite name, stared down from the walls with glass eyes that seemed to track my every movement. The air inside was thick with the scent of beeswax, lavender, and that faint metallic tang I couldn't place, like old pennies. "So," I said, my voice sounding thin and shaky in the vast hall, "where's the kid? You mentioned a sitting job." The room went cold. Mrs. Ullman's smile didn't falter, but her head tilted just a fraction of an inch to the side, a movement that was too smooth, too mechanical. "Ah," Mr. Ullman replied, clasping his hands behind his back. "A slight adjustment of expectations, Leo. There is no child. It is my wife's mother. She resides in the attic room. She is very old and very, very unwell. She requires absolute, unbroken silence for her rest. You won't see her. You won't hear her. We simply require a presence in the house while we attend our private engagement." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He fanned it open just enough for me to see the hundreds. "500, as promised," he whispered, "and another 300 for your discretion, for your silence. $800. I could pay the rent. I could buy groceries that weren't in a box. I could breathe again." I looked at the money, then at the dark, winding staircase that led up into the shadows of the second floor. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back in the Honda and never look back. But the weight of that $7.42 in my bank account was heavier than my fear. I took the envelope. "I'll stay," I said. Mrs. Ullman's smile widened just a fraction, and for a split second I thought I saw her eyes flash with something that wasn't joy. It was hunger. Part 3. The Pulse of the House. Narration style. Heavy-limbed, disoriented, building into a breathless panic. The sound of their car fading away. It was the loneliest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't just silence. It was a vacuum, a pressurized, heavy stillness that seemed to push against my eardrums until they throbbed with the rhythm of my own blood. I stood in the center of that foyer, clutching the envelope of cash, feeling the weight of the house settling onto my shoulders. Every floorboard I stepped on emitted a sharp, dry crack that echoed up into the dark rafters like a gunshot. I retreated to the den, sinking into the stiff leather sofa, trying to focus on my textbook, but the air in the room felt thin, as if the house were slowly breathing all the oxygen out of the space. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The grandfather clock in the hallway, its rhythm was changing. It was slowing down, stretching out, matching the heavy, sluggish beat of my own heart. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the house shifting, the wood groaning under the weight of its own history. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but there was no signal, just a dead, gray screen. I felt watched, not by a person, but by the room itself. The taxidermy deer above the fireplace. Its glass eyes seemed to have a wet, human sheen in the dim light. I could have sworn its head had tilted a fraction of an inch to the left since I'd sat down. It was that uncanny valley sensation again. The feeling that everything around me was a clever imitation of a home, but underneath the wallpaper, something was very, very wrong. Then the hunger hit, a sharp, hollow ache in my stomach that felt almost desperate. I'd ordered a pizza from a place called Mama's about 40 minutes ago, the only place willing to drive this far into the trees. When the headlights finally splashed across the den walls, I felt a surge of relief so strong I almost cried. I ran to the door, but before I could even reach for the handle, the doorbell rang, a single, mournful chime. I opened it to find a delivery kid, maybe 20, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. His face was pale, his eyes darting toward the dark windows of the second floor. He didn't even ask for the money. He just shoved the box into my hands, his fingers trembling, and whispered, "You should leave, man. Just leave." Before sprinting back to his car, he peeled out of the gravel driveway so fast his tires spat stones against the porch. I should have listened. I really should have listened. I took the pizza to the kitchen. The white tiles were so bright, they hurt my eyes. Sterile, cold, and perfectly clean. I ate 3 slices. They tasted wrong, metallic, like licking a copper wire. Within 10 minutes, the world started to tilt. My head felt like it was being stuffed with cotton, and my limbs, they were turning into lead. My arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I tried to stand up, my knees buckling, my vision blurring into a dizzying swirl of white and black. I slumped against the counter, gasping for air that felt thick, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. My eyes landed on a calendar pinned next to the industrial-sized fridge. There was a massive red circle around tonight's date. Inside it, written in that same elegant, jagged script I'd seen on the flyer, were 5 words that turned my boiling blood to ice. The lunar eclipse. The vessel is ready. Panic finally cut through the drug's fog, a cold spike of adrenaline that forced me to my feet. I bolted for the front door, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I grabbed the brass handle and twisted with every ounce of strength I had left. Nothing. It didn't even budge. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. I threw my shoulder against the oak. Thud. It was like hitting a mountain. I ran to the parlor windows, tearing back the heavy velvet drapes, desperate for a way out. I reached for the latch, but my hand hit something cold, something hard. Iron bars, thick black security bars, had been bolted into the exterior frames. I hadn't seen them when I arrived, or maybe I just hadn't wanted to see them. I moved from window to window, pulling back curtains, only to find the same cold iron. The house wasn't just a remote Victorian. It was a cage, and I was the only thing trapped inside. Then I heard it from the floor above, directly over the kitchen. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Something was moving in the attic. Something heavy. Something that was finally finished waiting. I stood at the base of the staircase, my hand trembling so hard against the mahogany banister that I could hear my fingernails clicking against the wood like a frantic telegraph. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The sound wasn't coming from the attic anymore. It was on the second floor landing. It sounded heavy, wet, like someone was dragging a carpet soaked in lead across the floorboards. I looked up into the throat of the house, and the shadows seemed to be coiling, dripping down the walls like black ink. My vision was tunneling now, the edges of my sight turning into a jagged, static-filled blackness. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. The drug, whatever they'd put in that pizza, it was stripping away my ability to think, leaving nothing but the raw, screaming instinct of a trapped animal. I had to hide. I couldn't stay in the open foyer. The taxidermy heads were watching me, their glass eyes reflecting a light that shouldn't have been there. I forced my leaden legs to move, crawling more than walking, pulling myself up the first 3 steps. The air changed as I ascended. It didn't smell like beeswax or lavender anymore. It smelled metallic, raw, like a butcher's shop, left out in the sun. And then I saw it. A mirror hung at the turn of the staircase, a heavy, ornate thing with a tarnished silver frame. I caught a glimpse of my own reflection, and I nearly choked. My face, it didn't look right. My eyes seemed to be shifted just a few millimeters too high. My mouth looked too wide. My skin had a gray, waxy sheen. It was the Thatcher effect. My brain was misfiring, unable to process the image of my own features. I looked like an imitation of a human. I looked like a monster. I looked away, my stomach heaving, and continued to crawl. The mother, Mrs. Ullman, had mentioned. I could see her shadow now. It was stretched across the floral wallpaper of the upper hall, a long, distorted silhouette that didn't look like an old woman at all. It was too tall. Its limbs were too long, too thin, ending in shapes that looked more like hooks than hands. It stopped at the edge of the stairs. I froze, pressing my face into the moth-eaten carpet, praying the shadows would swallow me whole. I could hear it breathing, not a human breath. It was a wet, rattling whistle, like air being pushed through a punctured lung. Wah. Iss. Wah. Hiss. And then a new sound sliced through the dark. Headlights. I didn't see them. I felt them. A sudden, violent flash of white light cut through the stained glass window above the front door, painting a kaleidoscopic pattern of blood red and sickly yellow across the foyer. The gravel outside began to crunch under heavy tires. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The front door, the door I'd thrown my body against just minutes ago, gave a sharp mechanical click. Leo, Mr. Ullman's voice drifted up from the foyer. It was louder now, resonant. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. The moon is almost gone, Leo. It's time to stop playing. It's time to fulfill your purpose. I tried to pull myself further into the dark, but my strength was gone. I was caught between the thing at the top of the stairs and the family waiting at the bottom. Part 5. The Throat of the House. Narration. Style. Visceral, suffocating, and punctuated by the rhythm of a panic attack. The slide was narrow, impossibly narrow, a vertical coffin of rough-hewn oak and century-old dust that seemed to squeeze the very breath from my lungs as I fell. I didn't tumble so much as glide, my numb, leaden body scraping against the wood. I should have felt the splinters tearing through my flannel shirt. I should have felt the heat of the friction against my skin. But there was nothing, just a cold, disconnected sliding sensation, like I was a piece of meat being dropped down a chute. I hit the bottom with a sickening, muffled thud, landing in a pile of something soft, damp, and smelling of deep, ancient earth. I lay there in the absolute blackness, gasping for air that felt like it was filled with powdered bone. My heart was a frantic, erratic thing, thumping against the floorboards of my chest like a bird trapped in a cage. Thump thump. Thump. Thump thump. I tried to move my hand to find some purchase in the dark, but my fingers felt like they were miles away, like they belonged to someone else entirely. When I finally managed to lift my hand into a sliver of light leaking through the floorboards above, I almost screamed. The Thatcher effect was worse now, much worse. In the flickering rhythmic light, my hand didn't look like a hand. The knuckles seemed to be on the wrong side of the fingers. The skin was a bruised, translucent violet, and the nails looked long, sharp, and jagged. My brain was screaming that this was wrong, that I was looking at a monster's limb, but I could feel the phantom sensation of my own thumb twitching. I wasn't just losing my mind. I was losing my shape. I was becoming the vessel they kept talking about. Above me, the house was alive with a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was a low, vibrating hum, a collective drone that seemed to be coming from the very walls. The cultists, the guests, they were chanting. It was a language that felt jagged, like the words were designed to tear at the throat of whoever spoke them. And through that drone, I heard the clicking. Click, click, click. The mother, she was right above me. I could see the tip of one of those long yellowed nails poking through a gap in the floorboards, testing the wood, searching for the seam of the hatch I'd just vanished through. Then, a face appeared. Not hers. Mr. Ullman knelt on the floor above, staring down through the cracks. The light from the black candles behind him cast his shadow over me, and for a second, the uncanny valley hit me with the force of a physical blow. His face. It wasn't the smooth, cultured mask from the foyer. The drug was making the shadows dance, and his features seemed to be melting, sliding, his eyes becoming two bottomless black pits that stretched toward his ears. His smile was too wide, too many teeth, all of them sharp and needle-thin. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a sketch of a man drawn by someone who hated humanity. "We see you, Leo," he whispered, and his voice didn't come from his mouth. It resonated inside my own skull, a vibrating, oily pressure. "The earth is already claiming you. The cellar is the womb, and the eclipse is the birth. Don't struggle. The more you fight, the less room there is for him." I scrambled backward, my elbows digging into the damp earth, my breath coming in jagged, sobbing gulps. I turned, crawling blindly into the crawl space, my head hitting low-hanging beams that felt like ribs. The space was filled with things, old porcelain dolls with shattered faces, bundles of hair tied with black twine, and jars filled with a thick gray fluid that seemed to pulse in time with the chanting above. I reached a wall, cold, damp stone, and felt a draft. A heavy, iron-bound door was slightly ajar, leading deeper into the sub-basement. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming like a dying animal, and stumbled into a room that smelled of copper and ozone. In the center of the room, beneath a grate that looked directly up into the center of the foyer, stood a stone altar, and on that altar was a suit, my suit, a set of clothes that looked exactly like the ones I was wearing. but they were laid out like a body, and next to them, a bowl of dark, steaming liquid and a curved obsidian knife. The humming above stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing my ribs. The shadow has touched the heart of the moon. Mrs. Ullman's voice drifted down, cold and final. Bring the vessel to the stone. I heard the hatch above me tear open with a violent, splintering crack. The hatch didn't just open, it was ripped from the floorboards with a violent, splintering shriek of wood on wood. A flood of sickly, flickering blue light poured down from the kitchen above, cutting through the basement's stagnant air like a blade. I didn't wait to see who or what was looking down. I turned on my stomach, my numb, leaden limbs scraping against the cold, packed earth as I dragged myself deeper into the sub-basement. The air here was different. It was heavy, wet, and carried a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. The smell of rotting peaches mixed with the sharp, acidic sting of formaldehyde. I crawled through a narrow stone archway, my shoulders brushing against walls that felt soft, like they were lined with damp velvet. I reached out a hand to steady myself, but instead of stone, my fingers sank into something cold and yielding. I pulled back, gasping, as a sliver of light from the grate above illuminated the wall. It wasn't velvet, it was clothes. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of jackets, flannel shirts, and hoodies were pinned to the stone, hanging like the discarded skins of insects. I reached up, my hand shaking so violently I could hear my teeth rattling, and touched a denim jacket. A wallet fell out of the pocket, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. I fanned it open with my clumsy, spider-like fingers. A student ID stared back at me, a boy, maybe 19, with a bright, easy smile and a shock of blonde hair. Caleb Miller, the card read. I looked at the next jacket, another ID, Marcus Thorne, then another. Ethan, Tyler, Sam. They were all young men. They all had that same look in their eyes, the look of someone who had seen a flyer for $500 and thought they'd found a way out of their debts. I wasn't the first sitter, and I wasn't the second. I was just the latest arrival in a long, silent line of vessels. I backed away, my head hitting a low-hanging wooden beam. Something fell from the ledge above me, landing in the dirt with a metallic clink. It was a small, silver picture frame. I picked it up, wiping away the grime with my sleeve, and looked at the photograph inside. It was the Ullmans. They were standing in front of this very house, but they looked younger, not by years, but by vitality. Their skin was glowing. Their eyes were bright, and their smiles were human. Standing between them was a young woman with long, dark hair and a face that radiated kindness. I looked closer, my breath hitching in my chest. The face. It was the same face as the mother upstairs, the same porcelain features, the same wide-set eyes, but in the photo, she wasn't a mask, she was alive. I realized then, with a soul-crushing horror, that the thing dragging its nails across the floorboards upstairs wasn't a mother at all. She was the first sitter, a girl who had come for the money and stayed to become a hollowed-out shell. A biological puppet kept alive by whatever rot lived in the foundation of this house. She wasn't an antagonist. She was a warning. Click, click, click. The sound was right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart stopping in my chest. The mother was crouching in the archway. In the dim blue light, the Thatcher effect turned her face into a landscape of nightmares. Her eyes seemed to be rotating in their sockets. Her mouth was a jagged, vertical slit that stretched from her nose to her chin. She wasn't looking at me with malice. She was looking at me with a profound, empty hunger. She tilted her head, her neck clicking with the sound of snapping dry kindling, and let out a low, vibrating whistle. Leo. The voice came from her throat, but it wasn't her voice. It was the layered, echoing drone of the cultists above. The transition is almost complete. Your skin is already beginning to feel like a stranger's, isn't it? Your memories, are they slipping? Do you remember your father's face? Or is it just a blur of gray ash? I tried to scream, but my tongue felt too large for my mouth. A thick, useless muscle that tasted of copper and earth. I scrambled backward, hitting the stone altar I'd seen earlier. The obsidian knife caught the light, gleaming with an oily, purple sheen. The robed figures began to descend the stairs now, their black silk garments hissing against the stone steps like a nest of vipers. Mr. Ullman led the way, his chest bare, his ritual scars glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse that matched the flickering of the blue candles. He held a bowl of dark, steaming liquid, the same liquid that was currently systematically erasing who I was. "Don't fight the eclipse, Leo," he whispered, his eyes now entirely black, reflecting the void that was consuming the moon outside. The girl was a failure. She had too much spirit, too much self left inside. But you are hollowed out by debt and desperation. You are the perfect house for a god. They surrounded the altar, their humming becoming a physical weight that pressed me down onto the cold, flat stone. I looked up through the iron grate, and the moon was gone. In its place was a blood-red ring, a devil's eye staring down into the cellar. Mr. Ullman raised the obsidian knife. Part 7, The Final Occupant. Narration style. Fading, ethereal, punctuated by gasps and the crushing weight of total psychological collapse. The stone of the altar was colder than the winter air outside, but I couldn't tell where the cold stone ended and my own skin began. I felt translucent, like a sketch of a human being that someone was slowly erasing with a heavy, smudge-filled thumb. I looked up through the iron grate, and the devil's eye moon stared back, a bleeding crimson ring that seemed to be pulsing in perfect time with the throbbing in my skull, my heart. It wasn't mine anymore. It was a heavy, mechanical hammer. Thud, 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 driving the last of my humanity into the dirt floor. The robed figures closed the circle. Their humming had reached a pitch that was no longer a sound. It was a vibration that felt like it was tearing my atoms apart. I could see the shadows on the walls dancing, stretching into shapes that defied geometry. Limbs that were too long. Heads that tilted at impossible angles. It was the uncanny valley of the soul. Everything about my existence, my memories of campus, the smell of my dad's old truck, the taste of that cheap pizza, it was all being compressed, flattened, turned into a thin, gray ash that was being blown away by a wind I couldn't feel. Mr. Ullman leaned over me. His face, it was a shattered landscape of shifting features. One eye was where his mouth should be. His nose was a jagged, vertical slit. His skin was the color of a bruised plum. The Thatcher effect had finally won. I couldn't recognize a human face anymore. He was just a collection of terrifying parts, moving in a horrific, synchronized dance. He held the obsidian knife above my heart, the blade reflecting the blood-red light of the eclipse. "The space is cleared," he whispered, and his voice sounded like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. "The debt is paid, the vessel is empty, and the guest is at the door." He didn't stab me. Not at first. He traced the tip of the blade along my collarbone, and instead of pain, I felt an opening, like a zipper being pulled down my chest. I felt myself, the core of who Leo was, spilling out onto the cold stone like spilled ink. I tried to cry out, but my mouth was no longer under my control. I felt my jaw unhinge, stretching, wider than a human jaw should ever go. My tongue felt like a thick, dry root, and my teeth, I could feel them sharpening, grinding against each other with a sound like breaking glass. "Look at me, Leo." Mrs. Ullman's voice drifted in, but she was standing behind me. I could feel her cold, skeletal fingers tracing the outline of my eyes. "Don't look at the knife. Look at the moon. See the eye? It's looking for its new home. It's looking for a place to rest its weary, ancient sight." The mother, the porcelain-faced puppet, crawled onto the edge of the altar. She leaned over me, her mask-like face inches from mine. For a second, her black hollow eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of the girl from the photograph. She wasn't screaming. She was waiting for someone else to join her in the gallery of the hollowed. She tilted her head, click, and a single black tear fell from her eye, landing on my cheek. It felt like liquid fire. Mr. Ullman raised the knife for the final strike. "Now," he growled, the word vibrating through the stone and into my spine. The blade came down, not into my heart, but into the center of my forehead. I didn't die. I expanded. The world turned blood red. I felt a presence, something vast, something ancient, something that smelled of the beginning of the world and the end of time, pushing its way into the space where Leo used to be. It was like a hand sliding into a glove that was far too small. I felt my ribs crack as they moved to accommodate the new weight. I felt my eyes roll back into my head, and suddenly I wasn't looking through my eyes anymore. I was looking through the red ring of the moon. I saw the house from above. I saw the Ullmans kneeling around my body, their faces turned upward in ecstatic terror. I saw the mother collapse into a heap of discarded silk and porcelain, and then I felt the hand, the entity, the guest. It took hold of my vocal cords. My mouth opened and a sound came out that wasn't a scream. It was a roar that shook the very foundation of the house. It was a name that made the black candles blow out and the iron bars on the windows rattle in their frames. Silence fell. The eclipse passed. The shadow slid off the moon, leaving it pale and indifferent once again. I stood up. My limbs felt different, longer, stronger. I looked down at the altar. There was a body there, a boy in a flannel shirt with a pale, empty face. He looked like someone I might have known once. A boy named Leo, who had $7.42 in his bank account. I stepped off the altar, my bare feet hitting the dirt with a heavy, purposeful thud. Mr. Ullman looked up at me. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was trembling. He pressed his forehead into the dirt, his voice shaking with a terrifying primal awe. "Master," he whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I walked toward the stairs, my new eyes adjusting to the dark. I didn't care about the rent. I didn't care about the disappointment in my father's voice. I just wanted to see what the rest of the world looked like through the eyes of a god.